In our solar system alone, there are 9 planets, some of which have satellites revolving around them, comparable in size to the Moon or Mars, and on which life is quite possible. And in our galaxy, according to various data, there are from 100 to 400 billion stars. Planets revolve around each of them, and some of them have conditions for life to arise. And that's just in our galaxy. There are several 100 billion galaxies in the universe alone, and so we can say with 100% certainty that there is life in the universe. And these are not just any bacteria, but also intelligent ones, and even far more advanced than ours. And that means someone could have flown to us, and a long time ago at that. Why haven't we made contact with them yet? Or at least haven't detected them? Why has no one come to us yet? Or maybe someone has come, but we don't know about it. You are on the Epoch of Mistrust channel with Mikhail Kalmykov, and today we will finally talk about them, the aliens. This question is not as simple as it might seem at first glance. In official science, there is even such a term, the Fermi paradox, which precisely highlights attention to this problem. Official science is continuously working on it. Very interesting hypotheses are put forward, for example, about some barrier, a great filter, which stands before every civilization in achieving a certain point in development. And as soon as a civilization reaches this level, it destroys itself or is destroyed. There is also the hypothesis of a unique Earth, which believes that our planet is truly unique. There is a hypothesis of the dark forest, going into virtual worlds, and even a galactic ethical code. Reading all these hypotheses, you gradually start to catch yourself thinking that these very people, those who laugh at alternative research, those who eagerly write them off as psychiatric cases, are producing something so far beyond the bounds of sanity that you stop understanding. And how, actually, did all these scientists figure out where sanity ends and schizophrenia begins? How does the theory of the great filter differ from the fantasies of the mentally ill? And what can be considered sane and what is a fantasy? And that's why, in this movie, we will be fantasizing. Fantasize on a given topic, and who knows, maybe our fantasies will be a bit closer to reality than the theory of the great filter of civilizations, especially since we have already answered the question about the Fermi paradox. Where are all the civilizations? Why don't we see them? 2 years ago, in the series of videos Who Shifted the Earth's Axis. Yes, the very same where I assumed the passage through the solar system and partially our local star cluster of some object possessing quite strong gravity, comparable in mass to the Sun or even higher. And judging by the fact that exactly from those times, from 2012, astrophysicists suddenly began to find these objects, we were not far from the truth with you. At this moment, astronomers have attributed 7,977 stars to this object. It coincides with the Sun by 95%, and it definitely passed through the Oort cloud, that is, through our solar system 2.5 million years ago. But the search is not over yet, and most likely not just one more suitable candidate will be found. Let me remind you briefly what my hypothesis was about. Some star, or more likely a black hole, passed very close to the solar system, practically inside it, through us, on the very edge of the Kuiper belt and the Oort cloud. Due to this passage, it brought tragic changes to the orbits of nearby and distant planets and comets. Some it swallowed, some it took with it, and some it stopped and directed towards the Sun with a hellish flow, sweeping everything in its path. And again, some planets were swallowed by Jupiter and Saturn, some were destroyed, and some were subjected to a ruthless meteor bombardment. Mars, Moon, Venus, and Mercury, and even Earth. But the catastrophe affected not only our solar system, but also the nearest, neighboring ones. The same thing most likely happened on Alpha Centauri, and in the binary system of Sirius, and in other star systems closest to us. And that's exactly why we don't hear or see any signs of intelligent life from there. It's either been destroyed by the same phenomenon, or it's at our stage of development. That's the whole mystery of the Fermi paradox. But I've already told all this in detail, point by point, over the past 2021st year. So if you need details and specifics, watch the videos on my channel for this period. And now it's time to talk about something else, about civilizations. That's why we are fantasizing now. Act 1. So, before we start fantasizing about aliens with you, we need to determine where they should have actually come to Earth from. This is among the most critical questions, not a trivial one. And here's why. Look, let's take a hypothetical civilization of intelligent beings. If they are at our level of development or lower, they probably won't be able to colonize even the moon, let alone interstellar flights. It's obvious. To have a full opportunity to colonize the moon, Mars, Venus, or anywhere else within the solar system, we need a qualitative leap in development. We need to solve a number of fundamental problems. First, engines, technologies, and fuel. Modern means of delivering people into space, to orbit or even further, are extremely energy consuming and very inefficient. They are extremely dangerous both for the people themselves and for the planet. And they consume resources very heavily. Even if we can throw, say, 100 colonists to the moon or Mars, it will be a one-way ticket 99% of the time. And this end will come very soon. Well, because this colony will need to be regularly supplied with fuel, water, food, oxygen, and so on. The slightest crisis on Earth and the supply of products will end, along with the lives of the colonists. Second, we need to solve the radiation problem. How economically and simply to protect at least a ship, and at most every astronaut individually, 100% from harsh cosmic radiation. We must either find a way to provide daily nutrition for astronauts over many months and sometimes years of flight, and find a way to put them to sleep, ideally anabiosis or another type of stasis. Or develop new, fundamentally different engines capable of accelerating the ship to extreme speeds. And of course, we need new materials, new ways of working with materials, and so on. In order for the colonists to be able to start construction of not only housing, but also plantations for food, livestock farms, metal production factories, fuel extraction, and so on, immediately upon arrival. At the moment, all we have are fantastic ideas. And there are no ready-made solutions, not even in exclusive trial versions. Everything that is being offered to us now is to mark the future with the help of computer 3500 models and cartoons. So, encountering a civilization exactly like ours does not shine for us. In any case, if someone comes to us, they will be immeasurably above us in development. Though, who knows when we will make the necessary technological leap? Maybe tomorrow? Well, all right. Let's assume our hypothetical civilization has dealt with all these problems and at the same time uncovered the secret of gravity. She successfully spread throughout the entire solar system, built space bases, colonized nearby satellites, planets and satellites of giant planets and asteroid fields, learned to extract energy from the ether, and even managed to reach speeds close to the speed of light. What's next? After all, this civilization lives only in its own system, and even within it, possessing such speeds, a flight from one planet to another can take many hours, even at the speed of light. In fact, the speed will be at least twice as less and maybe even less. And then, to get just to the outer edge of the Oort cloud, that is, the boundary of the solar system itself, they would have to fly at such a speed for more than a year, maybe 2 years, maybe 3, because it's impossible to accelerate to the speed of light and even more so to exceed it. And the issue here is not with Einstein, but as we explained in the previous video, with the ether. At the speed of light, the ether simply won't have time to pass through the ship and the crew, which on the one hand will create a wave of compressed ether in front of the ship, possessing real intrinsic mass, which will grow with each second and gradually, and maybe very quickly, turn into a real concrete wall, against which the ship will be smashed to a thin layer. On the other hand, the ether that has passed through the ship will stretch it, turning it along with the crew into a huge shapeless mass, which these two forces will ultimately just tear apart, mash up, and blend into a pulp like a blender. This effect is beautifully demonstrated by the current experiments on the Large Hadron Collider with the discovery of the Higgs boson. Again, the details are in the previous video, which is aptly titled, "What is ether, really?" This is directly related to the limitation on maximum speed, the speed of light. And it's almost impossible to bypass this prohibition in our universe. That is, no matter how you twist it, but for interstellar flights of our imagined civilization, we will still have to spend years, decades, for flights from one star to another. Not as bad as millennia, of course, but you can't do without hibernation. And therefore, this civilization will inevitably look for ways, on the one hand, to prolong life as long as possible, ideally to infinity, and on the other hand, how to preserve the body and consciousness, possibly in a frozen or static form. Although initially a flight of 10 to 15 years in one direction will also be acceptable. Approximately such a civilization at such a level of development will fly to us, can fly. And most importantly, it will definitely be from the nearest star systems, within say 10 to 20 light years. Guests from more distant systems, of course, could also be, but here again arises the question of energy expenditure. Such guests may fly to us purely for research purposes, just to understand what lies far beyond the boundaries of their system. Curiosity. But global resettlements, cosmic conquests, and similar mass expansion at such speeds and distances cease to make any sense. Simply because in case of extraterrestrial problems, let's say, in this system, there is already a civilization that can give some resistance, even if it's slightly less developed, but the replenishment will come very soon. The enemy overwhelms with their large numbers. And in the meantime, while the message of resistance reaches the nearest outpost, the replenishment will be prepared. By the time it arrives, the savages could well have raised their technological level. If there is no local civilization at the target star at all, that's also not a very good sign. Why isn't it there? What prevented it? In addition, knowledge about the ether as a pervasive field will inevitably lead civilization to other incidental discoveries. These discoveries will make the idea of moving to other star systems not just feasible, but unnecessary. But more on that later. So, there is a barrier, the insurmountable speed of light barrier. And this means that any aliens who would want and wish to take over our planet would be with 90% probability from our own solar system. And also a small, let's say, 10% probability that they came to us from the nearest star systems. That is, this is Alpha, Beta, and Proxima Centauri, Barnard's star, Lytan 16. Of course, Sirius, Epsilon Eridani, Procyon, Tau Ceti, and so on. But in this case, there can be no talk of any war or capture. Unless, again, for research purposes, or a mass evacuation on a hunch. But even on the scale of a single solar system, our native one, mass resettlement is a very, very difficult step. We are an example of this ourselves. Look, we have fully inhabited our own planet. Any random person right now can calmly buy a plane ticket and in just over a day, changing flights a couple of times, circle the planet. Information about it is spread almost instantly, thanks to the internet. But if a catastrophe happens, we are not capable of evacuating even a single city of 1 million people from one continent to another in any short period of time. Although this is possible, even at this stage, a mass of practically insoluble logistical problems will arise. If it becomes necessary to evacuate an entire country, let alone the smallest one, or God forbid an entire continent, it will turn into an absolutely insoluble problem. Why am I saying this? Because considering a visit from extraterrestrials from other star systems with the purpose of conquest is not worth it. The likelihood of resettlement is also low. Firstly, due to the reasons already mentioned. And secondly, if a civilization has advanced further and can obtain infinite energy and materials directly from the ether, then it no longer needs any stars or planets. Everything they need, they can create directly in space, on the spot. Perhaps this is another solution to the Fermi paradox. The highest civilizations simply do not need to communicate with others. They don't need other stars, other planets, or other civilizations. They have already reached the level of God. Now imagine that such civilizations existed on every or almost every planet in our system. Even now, at our current level of development, we could at least communicate between planets. And even occasionally send something, any kind of cargo, for example. And if the technological level was not even on par, but just slightly above ours, they could well fly with excursions from one to another. There is nothing fundamentally impossible in this. And suddenly we notice that an unwelcome guest is flying into our system. A black hole or another star. There's nothing impossible about this either. It happens all over the universe and nearby. Now we are actively scared that God forbid there will be a black hole nearby. It will suck in. The sentence is final. It is not subject to appeal, so don't even dare to think about it. We won't be able to. When I first voiced this idea in my videos 3 years ago, I was simply hit with a wave of hysteria. Hysteria indeed, because no reasonable arguments had any effect on people. There was just a panic fear, clouding reason and logic, projecting wild aggression in their comments towards the spreader of fear, that is, towards me. In fact, a black hole, although a scary object, is quite subject to the laws of physics. And if instead of the sun, there was a black hole of the same mass in its place now, it would not affect the orbits of our planets at all. Not at all. Absolutely. We would just stop receiving heat from the sun, but nothing else would be scary. The scary thing is not the black hole itself, but the chaos that a massive gravitational object passing through the solar system would cause. And then it absolutely doesn't matter what it was, a malicious black hole or a kind second sun. The chaos would be almost the same. The difference would probably only be that we would definitely notice the star first. Hundreds, if not thousands, of years before it gets close. That's one. And second, another star would bring far more death to our system than a black hole. At least thanks to the fact that it would have increased the amount of radiation that the planets would receive. With a high degree of probability, it would simply have scorched all the planets along with us, without even approaching them. Such a hell would not have happened with a black hole. However, for some reason, we are much more afraid of a black hole. So the danger appeared unexpectedly. Most likely, this black hole remained invisible, even while already in the Oort cloud. unless planets and asteroids, comets began to experience inexplicable gravitational anomalies as it approached, which, by the way, is still happening. In fact, everyone has heard about the unknown Planet 10, which astronomers are currently looking for and can't find, perfectly understanding that without it, such anomalies in the orbits of planets as now cannot exist. However, so as not to scare us, they modestly call it Planet 10. Although, judging by the influence it has on distant objects in the Kuiper belt, its mass is at least twice as large as Jupiter's, and most likely much more than that. But for some reason we can't see it. It is what it is. Let's continue. And it was only when our black hole entered Kuiper's belt that it became possible to accurately determine its size, mass, and flight trajectory. But it was already quite late. She broke all the orbits of distant comets and asteroids. Part of them she captured. The other part she directed with a destructive flow through the entire system to the Sun. Some planets she knocked off their orbits, collided one with another, as a result of which distant planets like Saturn and Jupiter significantly increased in size, turning into gas giants, simply swallowing several neighboring planets. As a result of the mutual gravitational maneuver between the Sun and the black hole, the entire solar system changed the inclination of the ecliptic. All the planets shifted their axis of rotation, and the solar system itself got a tilt of about 60 degrees to the plane of the ecliptic of our galaxy. We've already talked about all this in detail with you 3 or 4 years ago in the cycle's Invisible Apocalypse and Who Shifted the Earth's Axis. But in such a case, what remains for civilizations to do? The first thing that comes to mind, of course, is evacuation. But where to? With the current level of technological development, we can of course build spaceships. Fortunately, we have about 60 years of time in reserve. And how many intelligent beings will have to be transported? And most importantly, where to? If each planet had a population of say 1 billion people, then the total population for 10 or 20 inhabited planets would be between 20 and 40 billion. And that's just the people, intelligent beings, and they all need something to eat, both during the flight and after being saved already on another planet. Not a month, not half a year, but long decades or even centuries. They need something to breathe, and that means not just a ship is needed, and not even a fleet of ships, not a base, not hundreds of bases, not even an armada. A whole planet is needed the size of Earth as a ship, and possibly not even one. There is only one sensible solution in such a situation now. Do not inform the residents and quietly evacuate only the most valuable representatives of the race. Yes, it's harsh, but there are no other options. Otherwise, there will be panic, which will cause even more problems. But again, our projected situation brings its corrections. It won't be possible to inform the residents about anything. The catastrophe is inevitable, but it won't be possible to hide it. It will stretch over time for several decades. The gradual destruction of neighboring planets over such a period will be noticed even by the poorest and homeless. And then, seeing the surviving rulers, they will simply tear them to pieces. And then they will choose new ones, who also want to survive. They will also be torn apart, and they will choose new ones again, and so on. By the time the asteroid avalanche reaches the planet, there will be no life left on it. So it turns out chaos and panic are inevitable? Not necessarily. They are only inevitable in our society, with our mindset and our worldview, where each of us considers himself the only living organism in the entire universe. Where, for the sake of profit, we are quite capable of killing our own kind. In that ideology that is imposed on us now from the screens of televisions, from the internet, and in general at every step. But that doesn't mean it can't be different. There are other long-forgotten ideologies, starting with communism and ending with a caste society. such seemingly completely different ideologies. One of them is associated with either some unreal dream or repressions, depending on who you ask, and the other is perceived as a primitive language, where there was nothing but sticks and spears, no technical progress whatsoever. By the way, they also actively try to mix communism with the absence of progress, although this is not the case at all. So what do they have in common? The fact that in both cases money and egoism go to the background. The fundamental idea is understanding society as a single organism, in which a person is not only obliged and ready to sacrifice himself for the common good, but also does it with joy. And this is not something out of the ordinary. Such spontaneous manifestations of unity with society are preserved even in the capitalist world, and among religious confessions it is a normal phenomenon. More about this in the video The Root of Evil. So, if civilization has already reached the point of understanding and accepting its species as a single organism, then there will be no question of panic and saving its skin, spitting on the rest. And then salvation from our catastrophe should consist of 4 stages. The first thing these civilizations should have done, in my opinion, is to settle a small group of their representatives on each planet of the solar system and provide them with maximum protection. In other words, each planet of the solar system should have become a refuge, an enclave, where representatives of all civilizations would be gathered. Because it's unknown how many planets will survive and in what condition they will be after this. But in any case, except for the complete destruction of the system, all intelligent species would survive on at least one planet in this case. The second stage is the equipping of spaceships with a similar multi-civilizational composition, which will be sent on a long journey to the nearest star systems. Success. The third stage is the creation of a wide network of underground cities, storages for the main population. Of course, this won't save us from being swallowed by a black hole or falling into the sun. And even a sudden strike by a huge asteroid won't save us either. But if such a strike comes at a distance of 1,000 or more kilometers from an underground city, the chances of survival are very high. That is, such cities should be built at a great depth, say a kilometer or deeper, across the entire planet, on every planet. The fourth stage is the construction of star bases, repositories of civilization's knowledge, in which knowledge, intelligent beings, and technologies will be preserved for centuries, which will be needed for the solar system to come back into balance. And it seems like the most obvious solution. But then we would have discovered these bases a long time ago, right? Both yes and no. The thing is, there is the flatness of the ecliptic of the solar system. Along this flatness, all the planets rotate, but not only them, and the asteroid belt and the Kuiper belt too. And this means that the stream of asteroids caused by the black hole, which sweeps all the planets in its path, will also sweep away the constructed bases. The only option, in my opinion, to save them for hundreds of years ahead is to remove them from the path of the stream. And this means that the orbit of these bases around the Sun will definitely be polar. In this case, on the one hand, such bases will pass through a potentially dangerous zone only twice per revolution, and on the other hand, it will be very difficult to find these bases if you look for them in the usual flatness of the flight of celestial bodies, and very easy if you just look up, where it's usually empty and no one is there. Well then, let's check it out. If I'm right, the discovery of a space base, or even several bases of previous civilizations, is just a matter of time. We just need to find objects in the solar system with a polar orbit relative to the Sun. There can't be many such objects, so it instantly narrows the search from millions of objects to hundreds. After digging a little into tons of space reference books on small bodies of the solar system and creating a search algorithm, we find out that out of 1.5 million known small bodies of the solar system with such an orbit with an inclination angle of more than 60 degrees, there are only about 3,000. From them, it is necessary to select those whose orbits are as close as possible to the circle. This is absolutely unnatural, since to occupy a similar orbit, it is necessary to give the body a corrective precise impulse at least 3 times. Very precise, purposeful, and very strong. In exactly specified places and at exactly specified time. In other words, an object on such an orbit must have an engine, which means such an object can only be artificial. And yes, such an object was actually found. Only 1 out of 1.5 million, perfectly fitting into our conditions, and whose orbit is simply impossible under natural conditions. And besides him, there are 4 more, also quite close to fitting the description. A total of 5. 5 objects in the solar system that are 99% likely to be extraterrestrial bases of civilization. At the end of the video, I will tell you what these objects are, their coordinates and names in the National Aeronautics and Space Administration database, and in general in star maps and reference books. And we will return to the 3rd stage with you, to the one that implies the construction of underground cities and some kind of body freezing, or rather their immersion in some kind of stasis. There are plenty of reasons for this. Firstly, a body in a static state does not age, does not require much food, water, air, is not so demanding in terms of comfort. And of course, it allows to exist much longer, hundreds, thousands of times. Secondly, in this way we ensure individual preservation, even if the general repository with such sarcophagi is damaged. Of course, there will be a need for maintenance personnel, but only a few. You can periodically change shifts, waking up and going back to sleep stasis. Or you can trust everything to robots. But that's a matter of taste. Personally, I wouldn't trust absolutely everything to robots. And here we see the first paradoxical analogy with what actually exists in reality. Firstly, the religious ceremony is very similar to the cargo cult, in which many religions bury the bodies of their deceased relatives in graves or sarcophagi, hoping for some kind of resurrection. Specifically, bodily resurrection, that is, directly in the form in which the person died. Agreed, but the similarity with the process of being loaded into a stasis or anabiosis is simply 100%. In addition, we see a huge number of star fortresses on the planet, sometimes in those places where not a single army can reach. Sometimes, even with huge shaft wells going deep into the earth, built using technologies that are difficult for us to access even now. We know about a large number of underground cities, also built by unknown who, when, and why. For example, the Turkish city of Derinkuyu in Cappadocia. It has not been explored even 12% to this day. And it's not the only known underground city leading into the unknown. Such cities or entrances to them exist all over the planet. Another similar city is located in Peru, not far from Sacsayhuaman. I also talked about this in one of my very first videos. Right behind the famous megalithic fortress wall is not just the city of Cusco, but a whole temple complex of the ancient Incas, which was later destroyed, or more likely, simply renamed by the Spaniards into several temples. The Cathedral of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the Church of Iglesia de la Compañía de Jesús, the Church of Triumph, and so on. Note that this city and the wall and the temples were built by a single ruler, Manco Cápac, in the year 2000, all at once, in one fell swoop. And at the same time, he was the progenitor of all the known Inca tribe, which lasted only 300 and some years, until the Spanish conquistadors came and almost wiped out the entire population. The remaining Incas, located 70 kilometers north of Sacsayhuaman, in the small village of Machu Picchu, on top of a mountain, suddenly disappeared in one fell swoop, leaving the world with the mystery of their disappearance. In fact, the mystery here is far greater. For example, how could the bare, unarmed Indians build such fundamental structures in the mountains, like the fortress of Sacsayhuaman and the city of Cusco? Why, in 300 years, did they not master weapons, writing, or even the wheel? Why did they build so few cities in 300 years? How did they manage to build the small village of Machu Picchu at the very top of the mountain? And why? The location is very difficult to access. It would have been quite easy to defend against the Spaniards, but they didn't even bother to do that. It's quite clear that someone was leading them, the one who mastered all the technologies. And the Incas themselves didn't need to have this knowledge at all. Survivors developed in much the same way in other parts of the world, for example in India or Asia. And there we see fundamental structures, hiding underground cities not far from themselves, and at the same time a very weakly developed culture in the military and technical plan. They literally lived within their own boundaries, not trying to go far beyond their limits, as if the planet was divided among several civilizations according to the terms of some internal agreement. This is exactly how the centers of civilizations appeared in Egypt, the Middle East, Europe, and possibly Siberia, possibly in Australia, North and South America. Each canton had its own gods. They were not like the gods from other regions. And this is another, undoubtedly circumstantial, but still a sign, speaking in favor of some planetary community for surviving civilizations. In other words, even in these examples we observe the following. Out of the 4 stages of civilization's preparation for disaster, we can clearly observe the 3rd stage. Underground cities and various megalithic structures are obviously of a defensive nature, designed to protect from an unknown danger. We observe the 1st stage as well. This is a mention of different gods in different parts of the world. It quite fits the representatives of different civilizations. We can never observe the 2nd stage, that is, the sending of voyagers to other stars. Although there is a chance that sooner or later we will catch their signals. But in doing so, we are unlikely to understand what it is, since most likely the signals will be sent by an automaton, which we can simply take for a pulsating star. The 4th stage of the base storage remained in near space in the solar system. And as it turned out, they really are there. So, at the end of the video, I promise to show you where the space bases with the technologies of surviving civilizations are located. Remember, I assumed the conditions under which they should be placed, and as a result of searches according to the given parameters in the database of small bodies of the solar system from almost 1.5 million asteroids, comets, planets, and other bodies were found that fit the description. There are only 5 of them, but one object fits just perfectly. Its angle of inclination to the plane of the ecliptic of the solar system is 92 degrees, which is only 2 degrees away from the ideal. The eccentricity of its orbit is almost a perfect circle. Its year, that is, a full rotation around the Sun, is just over 3 years. The orbit is located between Mars and Jupiter and passes through the asteroid belt on one side, which allows it to be boldly considered a simple space stone. However, this object passes through the belt very quickly and only once every 1.5 years. Yes, any of our space apparatus, from Voyagers to Cassini and all the rest, have stayed in this belt much longer, hundreds of times, and all of them have successfully bypassed it. And this pebble appears in the belt only once every 1.5 years, and only for a couple of days. It's highly suspicious that passing through this belt, as well as near Jupiter's influence zone, this object did not change its circular orbit, which again may suggest the possible presence of some compensators, engines. And the circular orbit itself for an asteroid, let alone a polar one, is practically impossible. But it's ideal for a long-term base, which should avoid the destructive flow of asteroids from the Kuiper belt to the Sun as much as possible. But how so? Why do I think that the circular orbit is impossible? The Earth rotates around the Sun almost in a circle. Other planets too. The Moon around the Earth also rotates in a circle. Galileo's satellites of Jupiter also in a circle, and so on. What are you carrying, may I ask? Here's the thing. The fact is that there are only 3 variants for the formation of circular orbits. The first variant is the formation from a general protoplanetary disk during the birth of the solar system. Thus was born the Earth, other planets of the solar system, Galilean satellites of Jupiter, and the first 3-4 satellites of Saturn, and so on. Although with the satellites of Jupiter and Saturn, not everything is so simple. But in this case, the orbits of all celestial bodies will be plus-minus in the flatness of the ecliptic of the solar system. So, it doesn't suit us. We have a polar orbit. The second option for forming circular orbits is as a result of partial collisions in orbit, a kind of competitive struggle for a place in orbit. That's exactly how the Moon appeared, for example, or the asteroid belt. But first of all, they are also located in the plane of the ecliptic, and secondly, they had and still have many competitors, which we sometimes even see flying past the Moon to this day. And thirdly, they are essentially between 2 massive gravitational bodies that seem to compress, squeeze the orbit between them. In the case of the Moon, it's the Sun and the Earth. In the case of the asteroid belt, it's the Sun and Jupiter. And again, such orbits will lie plus-minus in the flatness of the ecliptic of the solar system. Again, it doesn't suit us. We have a polar orbit. There's not a single competing stone for billions of kilometers around. And only one massive gravitational object, the Sun. And the third option for the emergence of circular orbits is essentially through maneuvering with engines. Only in this way can you end up on a circular polar orbit around the Sun, where there are no competitors in the flatness of the polar orbit, no one at all, not a single stone. 1.5 million asteroids are in the perpendicular plane and do not bother our object at all. Neither they, nor Mars with Jupiter, nor even the Sun, nobody. And yet, it has a circular orbit. How did it appear? Only with engines, no variants. The name of this object in astronomical directories is 2010. Google it when you have time. There are also 4 other objects with similar data. However, the inclination of their orbits still doesn't reach the ideal, which could either suggest a real coincidence, which I personally doubt, or that these bases were created first, even as the black hole was approaching the solar system. Although I could be wrong, but their names in the catalog are as follows: 2016 LO90, 2016 LR90, 2018 XC6 2023 KQ5, XC6 2023 KQ5. As you can see, they all have been opened quite recently. And that means I really hope they are not the last ones. There will be more. A continuation is coming up